Hello everybody. It is April 26, 2025 here in the United States of America. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the proposed ceasefire coming from Europe in regards to the Russia-Ukraine war. As many of you might know, the United States proposed its own ceasefire deal several days ago. I read through that and talked about whether or not either side would or even could accept the terms to it. Now, I said that much of the deal landed in favor of Russia. Some of the proposals in it I do believe Russia would accept, while others not so much. Namely, some of the territorial concessions. Now, initially this conflict wasn't necessarily about territory. Keep in mind that Russia's initial peace offering or peace plan proposed back in 2022, a month or two after the war started, demanded really no territorial concessions, with the exception of, I do believe, semi-autonomous status for Donbass and Luhansk, and Russia was going to keep Crimea, but I believe it would have compensated Ukraine in some capacity for it. It wasn't until after that deal was rejected by Ukraine that Russia decided to permanently take territory. Statements from the Kremlin, the spokesman, Kremlin spokesman Peskov, I believe is his last name, did say that if Ukraine had offered to hand over what's left of the Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Donetsk, that would be acceptable to Russia. Now, whether or not this is just the Kremlin playing hardball or their actual concrete position, I'm not entirely sure. But anyways, let's get down to this proposed ceasefire deal from the Europeans. And before I read it, it is a very punitive towards Russia. It's treating Russia as if it's lost the war and is desperate to end it, and Europe is offering the privilege and the chance for Russia to walk away from this with a mere slap on the wrist. I think, as I mentioned before, European leaders seem to be a bit detached from reality. They're more concerned with moralizing and posturing, as opposed to engaging in any kind of real dialogue or real politic. That comes first and foremost to them. It's looking magnanimous and looking like the defenders of freedom and civilization above actually taking a realistic stance on anything. But anyways, let's get down to it. So, this is the ceasefire proposal coming from the Europeans. I'll read it point by point. Okay. Commit to a full and unconditional ceasefire in the sky, on land, and at sea. Both sides immediately enter negotiations on technical implementation with the participation of the U.S. and European countries. This is in parallel to preparation of the agenda and modalities for a full peace deal. Now, that is more or less the same as the U.S. peace deal. I mean, that's a given. The fighting has to stop if any kind of peace deal is to be reached. Ceasefire monitoring led by the U.S. and supported by third countries, also pretty much the same as the initial deal proposed by the U.S. This is where it differs a little bit. Russia must unconditionally return all deported and illegally displaced Ukrainian children, exchange of all prisoners of war, the principle of all for all. Russia must release all civilian prisoners. Now, this is based off of this story from a few years ago that Russia was kidnapping Ukrainian children and taking them to Russia to, I don't know, maybe brainwash them, put them in camps. I'm not really sure. I think it's kind of strange that this made it into the ceasefire proposal when I do believe that narrative was more or less debunked. Anybody looking at the war from a neutral standpoint disregards that accusation pretty wholeheartedly. That most of these kids were evacuated from frontline cities and taken to Russia to either live with relatives or to be protected until the war ends. I do believe some of them actually were returned to Ukraine. Again, it's like this is treating Russia as if it's, the assumption is that it's just holding a bunch of Ukrainians hostage and they just arrested them and deported them and has them in camps or something. I'm not really sure. Again, like this is not an accusation that has been taken seriously by anybody really following the war outside of Western European powers and Canada and whatnot. Anyone that's not already like I would say vehemently anti-Russian doesn't take this seriously. So the fact that it made it into the ceasefire proposal is kind of strange. Again, that's something Russia would look at and say, no, we don't. You're treating us if we're criminals. Now, I'm not getting into the legalities of this war, and I'm not trying to talk about this from like a pro-Russian perspective. I'm not getting a paycheck from the Kremlin or something stupid like that, but I'm simply acknowledging the fact that this is not an accusation that's been taken seriously by really anybody following the war from a neutral position or any serious journalist. So I think it's silly that this was put into the ceasefire proposal. I'm sure that Russia does have civilian prisoners, people that were accused saboteurs and whatnot. I'm sure. It says illegally displaced, all deported and illegally displaced Ukrainian children, and this is one of the issues with the accusations that were levied against Russia in the first place. Well, what's Russia supposed to do? It takes a frontline city. There's a bunch of children that were rescued from the fighting. Were they supposed to just be left where they were at, exchanged immediately on the spot in the middle of a war zone? I'm not entirely sure, but I find that kind of strange too. Again, that's Europe moralizing. It has to. Within the ceasefire, it has to make sure that it lets the world know that Russia bad, Europe good, Russia moral, Europe moral, Russia immoral. I mean, that's how it comes off to me, and I'm sure that's how it would be perceived by the Russians. So the next part, security guarantees for Ukraine, which, like it or not, for people that are pro-Russian, there will have to be security guarantees for Ukraine. Europe is going to demand some kind of security guarantee to deter future Russian aggression as they would perceive it. Whether or not Russia actually would intend to invade Europe, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that they don't, but maybe a future Russian leader, one that's a bit more aggressive and nationalistic, might change their mind on that. Who knows? Well, that's from Europe's point of view. That's what they worry about. Now, keep in mind these tensions within Europe, among the Europeans, among the Russians, this goes back centuries. This is not something easily dealt with, and to placate the Europeans, there probably would have to be some kind of reasonable security guarantee in place for them to accept a ceasefire. Now, would Russia accept security guarantees? I'd say yes, within reason, but no NATO troops themselves within Ukraine. That seems to be a pretty big no-no for Russia. A very massive red line, if you will, sort of defeats the entire purpose of the war from their perspective. Anyway, Ukraine receives robust security guarantees, including from the U.S. Article 5-like agreement, while there is no consensus among allies on NATO membership. Now, this is a big difference between this deal and the U.S. deal. The U.S. deal is grounded more in political reality and realism than this one, and this is exactly why. Russia has said absolutely vehemently, no Ukraine in NATO. No questions asked. That's off the table. Ukraine cannot join NATO. Again, that's one of the reasons from the Russian perspective for the war starting in the first place. And right here in the European ceasefire, again, this is why I'm saying that it's treating Russia like it's lost the war. Right here, they say no consensus among allies on NATO membership. It's leaving the door open for NATO membership. Russia would see this and immediately reject the deal. From their perspective, they'd be right to reject the deal because their stance has always been no Ukraine in NATO, and they've shed a lot of Russian blood to ensure that that doesn't happen. Now, from Ukraine's perspective, is that fair that they won't be able to join NATO? Sure, it's not fair. The world's not fair, and if you're in the position that they're in, well, you can't make demands like that. The U.S. proposal says no, absolutely no Ukraine in NATO, but it can join the European Union. Now, that is something that's probably acceptable to Russia, but even leaving the door open for Ukraine in NATO, which means long-range missile systems and NATO weaponry right on Russia's border, that they would reject that immediately. Which, again, like, this is why it seems to me that these aren't serious peace proposals. Again, this is just Europe moralizing and posturing and showing that, you know, they're resolved to punish Russia and fight to the bitter end. You know, I feel like Europe is so deluded at this point, or European leadership is so impractical and has such an unrealistic position in regards to foreign affairs, that I don't know, you could have foreign armies marching on Paris and the French would still be demanding the unconditional surrender of whatever nation's military was currently occupying the Eiffel Tower. Again, as I've mentioned before, again and over, Europe seems more concerned with posturing and moralizing than anything else. I think much of that comes from the aftermath of World War II. Okay. No restrictions on the Ukrainian defense forces. Again, this is not something the Russians are going to accept. They will not accept a large military presence directly on their border. They won't accept a large military on their border that they may have to fight in the future if there's no restriction. Again, this is from the Russian point of view. To the Ukrainians, this would be absolutely advantageous because they could prepare for another possible future war with Russia, and they could make their military as large as they wanted to. Now, Russia would not want any sort of military buildup on their border, so they absolutely would demand that the size of the Ukrainian military be capped at an acceptable level, one that could reasonably guarantee the defense of Ukraine without threatening Russian territory. That's what the Russians would demand. Now, like I said before, absolutely Ukraine would like to not have any restrictions on their military, but I do believe at this time they don't exactly have the bargaining chips to successfully petition for that. Again, it's another unrealistic proposal from the Europeans. Okay, continue on. The guarantor states will be an ad hoc group of European countries and willing non-European countries. No restrictions on the presence, weapons, and operations of friendly foreign forces in the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine pursues accession to the EU. Again, this next point. Russia is not going to accept an unrestricted European military presence directly on their border, again, because the way that this is proposed, it seems like Europe, at the drop of a hat, would be ready to resume hostilities with the Russian Federation. So then the Russians would probably just end up fighting all of Europe directly on their border, rather than just the Ukrainian military. Why would they accept this, given the position that they're currently in, which is that they are slowly but surely winning the war? Now, I'm not saying this from the perspective of a paid Kremlin agent. It's just the reality on the ground. I'm sorry, but reality doesn't care about your political alliances, or opinions about anything. Reality is reality, and I'm a realist. And if your nation is losing battle after battle after battle, and engagement after engagement after engagement, and it has been doing so for years, and that nation is entirely dependent on foreign support, then I would say at that point you're not in a winning position, especially considering the Russian Federation still has massive military reserves and untapped military potential that it could use. Much of it's being held in reserve for a potential war with NATO, but this war could continue on for several more years before the Russians even really feel any kind of ill effect, and by then I would say the Ukrainians would have all but lost everything. U.S. pursues ascension to the EU, as I just mentioned. Yeah, that's also in the U.S. proposal, but this idea of a completely non-restricted military presence, weapons, and operations of friendly forces in the territory of Ukraine, that's not in the U.S. deal, again, because it's not a realistic position, and U.S. diplomats know it. But again, as I've mentioned before, for the millionth time, Europe is more concerned with posturing and moralizing rather than finding a solution that would end this war. So, territory issues will be discussed and resolved after a full and unconditional ceasefire. Territorial negotiations start from the basis of the line of control. Ukraine regains control of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant with U.S. involvement, and also Kakhovka Dam. So in the U.S. proposal, they say that Crimea will be officially recognized as part of Russia, de facto, and then de jure, or excuse me, no, I think it's de jure recognition of Crimea and de facto recognition of everything behind the line of contact, which again is the realistic position. Russia is not going to give up this territory. It's unthinkable for Russia. Russia fought to take it. It's historically, again, just talking about history and reality here, the Russians consider it part of Russia, and it's filled with Russian-speaking peoples. From a realistic perspective, Russia could not be expected to just hand this over when it's lost, tens of thousands, if not well over 100,000 men to keep and hold this territory. They're not going to give it up. Which is why in the U.S. proposal, the U.S. has proposes to recognize the fact that this territory is now under Russian control. Now, not officially. I mean, it's not going to be considered Russia on any official maps, at least at this time, but the acknowledgement is there that, yes, this is Russian territory now, and that must be accepted. And the Europeans apparently have no desire to accept that. I think they believe that. Again, I think some of this is also meant to placate the Ukrainians. Europe, given its moral stance on the issue, does not want to tell Ukraine that it must accept the losses of its sovereign territory, because Europe is all about sovereignty, protecting sovereignty, freedom, and democracy. And also, too, I think that if they were to firmly tell the Ukrainians that they have to give up territory, the Ukrainians would be very unhappy to hear that. But it's the realistic position. Okay, what's the next part here? Sorry, I have this screenshotted on my phone. I'm a boomer. Well, not really, but I feel like one. U.S. regains control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant with U.S. involvement. Yeah, I just read that. Yeah, that's also in the U.S. proposal, too, that Russia gives back the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But the U.S. does specify that power from that power plant would go to Russian territories in the area as well as Ukrainian, and they would like to run it as a third party to make sure that that is the case. Does that seem like a bad proposal? No, but would the Russians be willing to give something back that they've captured in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast? I don't know. Maybe. If they thought it was pragmatic and something they could live with, but I'm not entirely sure if they would do that. The Ukrainians absolutely would. I think go for that, but they would want to be in control of the power plant. But I think the U.S. understands that they can't trust the Ukrainians with holding that power plant, and they want it under U.S. control for a reason. They want to protect that plant from sabotage from either side, and I don't think they would trust the Ukrainians to let power from that power plant actually go into Russian territory. So again, I feel the U.S. thinks it would be better off under a third party. Ukraine enjoys unhindered passage of the Dnieper and control of the Khyber and Split. Now, the U.S. proposal does talk about unhindered passage of the Dnieper River, but it does not mention control of the Khyber and Split. I don't think Russia would accept that. It's not going to give back that. It's on the Russian side of the river. Why would they give it back? As far as unhindered passage of the Dnieper River, yeah, for economic purposes, but I don't think the Russian military would be thrilled about having military equipment, boats, gunboats, and whatnot, and patrols going up and down the Dnieper when they themselves can't use it. I don't think that's. If I was making a proposal and that was part of it, I would say non-military vehicles should be able to pass unhindered through the Dnieper for economic reasons. I mean, Ukraine still needs to have a viable economy after this war is over to continue on as a nation state or a functional nation state. Okay, and then now we're down to the economic section. U.S. and Ukraine implement economic cooperation minerals agreement. That's in the U.S. proposal. I believe Ukraine will be fully reconstructed and compensated financially, including through Russian sovereign assets that will remain frozen until Russia compensates damage to Ukraine. Again, this is treating Russia like it lost the war. Russia wouldn't accept that kind of proposal. It's Russia's money. why should they accept the fact that their money that's been frozen by the Europeans is going to be sent to Ukraine to build it, and they have to pay it back anyways? No, I don't believe the Russians would accept that. That's treating them as if they don't have a choice but to accept. And most of these proposals in here are treating Russia like it doesn't have a choice but to accept these, as if it's desperate to end the war, and that doesn't appear to be reality on the ground. U.S. sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014 may be subject to gradual easing after a sustainable peace is achieved, and subject to resumption in the event of a breach of the peace agreement. Yeah, Europe has no intention on dropping sanctions against Russia, which I don't think Russia cares anyways. And even insofar as the U.S. sanctions, I think it would benefit Russia economically if it could do business with the United States again. But Russia doesn't need business with the United States. That's the thing. So the dropping the sanctions on Russia, I think, is based off this misunderstanding of the Russian economy currently, that it's in desperate need of reconnection with the West, when it doesn't seem to be. The ruble's doing well, and the Russian economy seems to be robust without much interaction with the West. And if you're going to place a carrot in front of somebody, it better be a carrot that looks appetizing, not one that they're currently not hungry for. So I again, this proposal is really not filled with any kind of proposal that has real leverage on Russia or would actually be enticing to Russia. This is, I would say, entirely beneficial to Ukraine, not the Russians. If this was written by somebody in Europe that actually did have a realistic grasp of this war and were more concerned with ending it in a way which it could be ended, then I don't think this peace proposal would look like this. This comes down to, as I've mentioned before over and over again for the millionth time, this comes down to posturing and moralizing more than anything else, and showing the world that Europe has Ukraine's back and it's not going to accept anything other than essentially Russia's surrender. And I feel like at this point Russia could be on the outskirts of Kiev once again and holding almost everything east of the Dnieper, and the Europeans would still hold these positions. So what I think is going to happen is whatever U.S. position, or excuse me, whatever amended U.S. proposal comes out, I think it's, if Russia accepts anything, it's going to be that. I think Russia is going to have to make concessions to end this war. You do have the pro-Russian crowd that talks about taking everything up to the Dnieper, complete and total unconditional surrender of Ukraine. I don't think that's a realistic outcome. Europe won't let that happen. Russia is going to have to make concessions somewhere that it can live with, but it's not going to have to make nearly the amount of concessions that Ukraine has given its position. As I mentioned before, if Ukraine had accepted the 2022 peace proposal, its sovereignty would be largely intact. But it would appear that Ukraine leadership, with urging from the Europeans and possibly Washington at the time, decided to bet the house on a military defeat of Russia. Again, because Russia wasn't performing in the way that Western powers thought they would, and they took that as a sign of weakness on the part of the Russians. I wouldn't say it's weakness, it was just Russia wasn't prepared to fight that kind of war. This was a gamble for the Russians, and it almost worked. Russia wanted Ukraine to capitulate politically and give the Russians what they wanted in regards to security guarantees without having to take large swaths of the country. Russia wasn't prepared to do that. When the West realized that, it mistook that for complete Russian incompetence, and this notion that Ukraine could sweep the Russians back to the 1991 borders, and that the Russian military was a massive paper tiger. When in reality, all Russia really needed was a few months to prepare its military to fight the kind of war that it was going to have to fight. They would have to bring more men to the front, more equipment. They would have to do a mobilization. But once they did that, and Russia resolved to fight the war that it's fighting now, people need to keep in mind, despite some of the internal issues with the Russian military, Russia is still one of the three preeminent world powers. Its military is still much more capable and much more powerful than any military in Europe. And the Europeans apparently lost sight of that. So when they urged the Ukrainians to fight on to the bitter end, they lost their one chance at Ukraine retaining all of its sovereignty without sparking World War III. And it's unfortunate, but when you bet the house, sometimes you lose the House. So anyways, that's that sums up all the proposals, the peace proposal from the Europeans. As I just mentioned, I believe the Russians would be more likely to accept a U.S. proposal, not because the U.S. is pro-Russian, but U.S. diplomats seem to have a more realistic take and understanding, or a realistic take on this war and a better understanding of what's happening on the ground. Maybe not initially, but they definitely do now. I think Trump's lead negotiator, Witkoff, has a much better and more realistic appreciation of things in general when it comes to negotiating deals than the Europeans do. He's not really concerned with moralizing and posturing. He seems more pragmatic and a bit more concerned with just getting a deal done in the most realistic way possible. Would the Ukrainians accept this deal? Yeah, this deal is meant for the Ukrainians to accept. I'm sure that all of this was run by Zelensky, and this was meant to be something politically digestible for Zelensky to accept at home. Now, keep in mind, if Zelensky were to accept the U.S. proposal, I don't think he would last very long in office, and the Ukrainian hardliners and nationalists wouldn't be thrilled. I think they would probably remove him or expunge him from power, either forcefully or strongly urging him to do so, and then the war would continue. It seems to be the big impediment to ending this war. Is Zelensky has certain positions that he can't take publicly, given the spot that he put himself in, without putting himself in some pretty serious political and physical danger. Even if he were to admit Ukraine's current position in regards to winning this more publicly, the backing that he does receive from the more ardent and hardcore Ukrainian nationalists, well, that would disappear pretty quickly, and I think he would be in a very precarious position. It would seem to be, and I've read an interview with Vladimir Klitschko where he talked about Ukraine needs to. He suggested that Ukraine would need to make territorial concessions to end the war. He took a more realistic approach, but he said he hinted that Zelensky doesn't want to speak to him about it or invite him to any of the negotiating processes. It would seem that Klitschko's position is something the average Ukrainian seems to hold, but the Ukrainian nationalists are the ones that are resolved to fighting to the bitter end, and they're the ones that run the military and are in control of the government. So, with this, to sum it up, with this ceasefire proposal, Russia absolutely would not accept it. Nothing in this, for the most part, would be acceptable to the Russians, except for maybe some of the stuff that it shares in common with the U.S. peace proposal. Ukraine would absolutely accept this, and I think at the end of the day, though, this wasn't proposed as a serious resolution to this war. This was to show where Europe stood on the war in regards to supporting Ukraine, and the bare minimum that it would accept to allow for a ceasefire to happen. So what do I think is going to happen? I think the war is going to probably continue on for another few months before a more realistic ceasefire proposal is put on the table. I think it's going to be the Russians that would accept it first, and then Ukraine would probably have to be pressured into accepting it. I think one of the things that President Donald Trump might do is he might get to a point where he says, you either accept this deal because this is the best deal you're going to get, or we withdraw all military support, which the U.S. has already withdrawn a lot of military support, but if it could somehow talk European powers into doing the same, Ukraine would have to come to the table quickly. But I think Trump would probably try to put pressure on Zelensky. I think he's talked about walking away from the war for that reason. I think the U.S. has come to the understanding that whatever ceasefire proposals are put forward, if they're realistic, then it would be the Russians that would accept them first. Because again, Russia is currently in a position of strength in regards to the direction of this war, and Ukraine is not, but Ukrainian leadership is in a pretty tight political bind on what they can publicly accept. And with Europe's continued full backing and posturing, the Ukrainians they feel like they can continue to fight and they continue to receive support until that miracle happens where Russia just collapses overnight. But anywho, I feel like this is getting a little long-winded here. But yeah, to sum it up, unrealistic proposal by the Europeans. I don't think the Russians would accept it. So the war will continue for the foreseeable future until yet another proposal is made, and I think that the Ukrainians would have to be publicly pressured by all parties involved that are supporting them into accepting some kind of ceasefire. But anyways, if everyone out there liked this video, please drop me a like, comment, subscribe, and whatnot, and I will be back Wednesday with another video. Have a great day.